In the last months of 2011, Libya was plunged into an open war. The cities in the north suffered constant sieges. The state that for decades had been controlled with an iron fist by Muammar Gaddafi was fragmenting in the face of militias and foreign bombings. Sirte, his place of origin, became the last bastion of resistance, surrounded by fighters determined to end his regime. In that scenario of collapse, without functioning institutions and with thousands of displaced people, the figure of the leader who had dominated the country since 1969 was also collapsing. For more than 4 decades, he had molded a personalistic system, mixing internal repression with a changing role abroad. Who was he really, and what was his horrendous end? A child of the desert. There was no official record of his birth. It was only known that he had come into the world in 1942 in a dusty area on the outskirts of Sirte, in the central part of the Libyan coast. His family, part of a Bedouin tribe that roamed the desert in search of pasture and water, lived in rudimentary tents and depended on livestock. His father was a shepherd and could barely read. His mother also had no formal education. The environment was harsh, without comforts or access to basic services. The extreme conditions forged his character from an early age. He learned to navigate the sand, heat and scarcity without contact with cities or modern life. From childhood, he witnessed how his people were treated as inferior by urban authorities, especially in Tripoli, where Bedouins were seen as backward. The reigning monarchy, allied with Western interests, did not represent the inland communities. Oil had not yet transformed the country, and the contrasts between urban sectors and rural regions were enormous. In areas far from the capital, poverty was almost absolute. Schools were scarce and opportunities non-existent. However, his family managed for him to attend a small school in Sirte. There he began to stand out. His teachers noticed that he was diligent, curious, and very aware of his surroundings. Although he lacked resources, he showed an uncommon determination. He was especially interested in history and politics, and very soon began to ask uncomfortable questions. He listened carefully to news about the Arab world. Soon he began to speak with admiration of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader who promoted Arab unity and independence against colonialism. The young Libyan was fascinated by his discourse and his figure. He began to copy his gestures, his phrases, his way of dressing. In 1956, when he was still an adolescent, something happened that would mark him. During the Suez Crisis, Egypt was attacked by Israel, France, and the United Kingdom. Nasser nationalized the canal and challenged foreign powers. In Libya, most of the population followed the events with attention. The young man organized a student demonstration in support of Nasser. It was his first political act. Despite his young age, he showed leadership and an ability to rally people. The teachers reprimanded him, but among his peers he gained respect. From then on, he began to think about organizing himself more seriously. After finishing primary school, he moved to Sabha, a larger city in the south of the country. There he entered a secondary school, where he continued his studies. In that diverse environment, with students from different tribes and regions, he reinforced his nationalist vision. He observed how poverty, discrimination, and backwardness were shared by many, and how the monarchy offered no solutions. It was in Sabha where he began to form a small group of young people with similar ideas. They read pamphlets, analyzed Nasser's speeches, discussed the future of Libya. They did it in secret, aware that they could be punished. In 1961, after finishing high school, he decided to enroll in the military academy in Benghazi. He chose that path because he considered the army to be the only institution capable of bringing about real change. He did not trust political parties or traditional institutions. He thought that only the military could end the monarchy and foreign influence. His time at the academy coincided with a period of agitation in the country. Oil was beginning to generate significant income, but the wealth was not being distributed. King Idris maintained a complacent attitude towards foreign companies, and the majority of the population remained excluded. During his military training, the young man showed discipline, ambition, and a strong sense of mission. He was not a brilliant student from a technical point of view, but he stood out for his leadership ability and ideological conviction. He kept in touch with his Sabha group, which now operated with more discretion. They used pseudonyms and communicated through coded notes. As the years went by, his small circle transformed into a well-organized cell. They planned a decisive action but knew they had to wait for the right moment. In 1963, he made a brief stay in the United Kingdom, where he participated in a military training course. The experience did not impress him. He returned with a negative image of British culture, which he considered decadent and far removed from the values of the Arab world. This impression reinforced his rejection of the West. He was convinced that Libya had to free itself completely from all foreign influence. Upon his return, he intensified his clandestine work. He was no longer just a young man with ideas. Now he had a plan. In 1965, he began to draft a political project with his companions. They called it the Secret Movement Project. It was inspired by Nasser's thinking and proposed the need for a revolution led by young officers. The document, although rudimentary, contained the basic elements of what would later become his ideological platform. It included criticisms of the monarchy, proposals for redistributing oil wealth, and a call for Arab unity. The group had no official name but acted firmly. They were no longer simple students with dreams. They were preparing to seize power. In 1966, he was assigned to an army unit near Tripoli. The transfer allowed him to expand his network of contacts, especially with other young officers who shared his vision for change. In this new environment, he was able to observe how other units were beginning to articulate critical views of the regime. Instead of being limited to the Saba circle, his project acquired a national dimension. Vigilance remained intense, so every exchange had to be carried out with caution. The idea of a coordinated action was taking shape, but they knew that the risk was high and that any misstep could expose them. In mid-1968, the situation in Libya became more tense. The king was ill, and there was talk of a possible succession. The young officers perceived that an opportunity was approaching. They analyzed different scenarios and decided to move forward. They proposed to act before another group took the initiative. In the first months of 1969, they began to mobilize. They held more frequent meetings, collected funds, identified key points in Tripoli. Their plan was to execute a bloodless coup, taking advantage of the general discontent and the weakness of the regime. In that environment, the young man who had been born without a record, raised among goats and desert wind, was about to become the leader of a country. He was only 27 years old and had never held an important position. He had no international backing or political structure, but he had something few had, a network of loyalties forged in clandestinity, a clear vision of the future and absolute determination. The overthrow of King Idris and the seizure of power. In the mid-60s, young Gaddafi had already joined the Libyan army after finishing his studies in Benghazi. His time at the military academy not only consolidated his pan-Arabist ideas, but also allowed him to establish ties with other officers of his generation who shared his vision for change. The military institution functioned as a closed space where his political ideas strengthened while the monarchy showed signs of weakness. Although King Idris remained in power, many saw him as distant and out of touch with the demands of a society increasingly connected to the nationalist discourse coming from Cairo. In this context, Gaddafi perceived an unprecedented opportunity to act from within the military structures, taking advantage of growing discontent. During those years, his closest circle began to take shape. While the king's administration maintained close ties with Western powers and preserved colonial structures within its institutions, the group led by Gaddafi advanced in creating a clandestine network within the barracks. They were not public figures, nor did they have the backing of any party, but their presence in different military units gave them access to key information and allowed them to gauge the timing with discretion. Despite their youth, the group operated with meticulous discipline. They met in private homes, avoided unnecessary exposure, and limited communications to strictly trustworthy circles. Gaddafi's figure consolidated as a natural leader, not because of his military rank, which was modest, but because of his ability to articulate ideas and maintain group cohesion. During the years prior to the coup, Libya experienced apparent stability. Newly discovered oil wealth was beginning to transform certain areas of the country, but the distribution of these resources was unequal. Rural areas remained mired in poverty, and decisions remained concentrated in an aging elite. Although a constitution existed, its application was limited, and parliament operated under the control of the palace's inner circle. Rumors about the king's possible abdication intensified as 1969 progressed. Idris spent long periods outside the country, and his health began to deteriorate. In this context, the group of officers led by Gaddafi decided that the time to act had arrived. The chosen date was the 1st of September, taking advantage of the monarch's absence and temporary disorganization within the chain of command. During the night before the coup, key units in Benghazi, Tripoli, and other strategic bases were taken without resistance. There were no clashes or shots fired. The deployment was fast and precise. Radio stations came under the movement's control in the early hours of the morning. When ministers began to learn what was happening, they no longer had the capacity to react. The operation was executed with such speed that many citizens woke up without knowing that the country had changed regime overnight. King Idris, who was in Turkey for medical reasons, was informed of the coup by third parties. The news surprised him, leaving him no room to plan a response. His nephew, designated as heir, was arrested without resistance. Within a few hours, the Revolutionary Command Council, headed by Gaddafi, took absolute control of the state. The first official communication of the new regime was a radio broadcast announcing the end of the monarchy and the beginning of a new republican stage. The message was written in a solemn tone, with references to national dignity, social justice, and the need to free the country from foreign dependence. The council did not immediately reveal the names of its members, projecting an image of unity while securing control of the state apparatus. The institutions continued to function during the first days, under new orders coming from a small group of young officers. In the streets, the population reacted with surprise, but without signs of resistance. Some sectors celebrated the end of a regime perceived as obsolete, while others waited cautiously to see the direction of the new leadership. The international press described the coup as a change without violence and highlighted the enigmatic figure of the young colonel who had not yet appeared in public. During the following days, state media began to build his image as that of an austere, disciplined leader committed to the people. The first official photographs showed a sober Gaddafi, without a gala uniform or flashy insignia. His language was direct and constantly appealed to national unity. Unlike other military coups in the region, his was not presented as an individual seizure of power, but as a collective action aimed at correcting a wrong course. The other members of the Revolutionary Command Council remained in the background. Although formally they were equals, Gaddafi's voice prevailed in communiques and key decisions. His influence did not come from a distinguished military career, nor from family ties with traditional elites, but from his ability to articulate a narrative that combined Arab nationalism with Islamic identity and the redistribution of wealth. As the weeks passed, the new government began to implement symbolic measures. Partial nationalization of certain sectors was ordered, foreign bases were closed, and an independent foreign policy was adopted. Western embassies were instructed to renegotiate their agreements under new terms. The new regime did not seek isolation, but it did make clear that Libya would decide its alliances from a sovereign position. The council also launched a series of internal reforms. The judicial system was reorganized, educational content was reviewed, and stricter control was imposed on the media. In parallel, a surveillance structure was created to monitor any attempt to restore the monarchy. Although there were no public executions or open repression in those first months, the security apparatus began to strengthen from the outset. Gaddafi insisted that the revolution should be defended not only in discourse, but also in action. For this reason, every appointment to key positions was carefully evaluated. Loyalty to the new order became an indispensable condition. Links with the previous regime ceased to have institutional validity. The new stage advanced without concessions to figures of the past, and every gesture of doubt remained under suspicion. By the end of 1969, Gaddafi's figure already occupied the center of the national scene. Although the council continued to operate as a collective body, he was the one who spoke to the press, received foreign delegations, and signed the most important decrees. State media began to construct a heroic narrative around his leadership. His youth was presented as a symbol of renewal, his military training as a guarantee of order, and his humble origin as proof of popular authenticity. In a short time, the new regime went from being an experiment of idealistic officers to a solid structure headed by a charismatic leader who projected confidence and firmness. The coup had been bloodless, but its impact was felt in every corner of the country. The monarchical era had ended, and in its place a revolution began that promised to leave nothing untransformed. Consolidation of the regime and the imposition of the Green Book. Following the triumph of the coup and the fall of the monarchy, Muammar Gaddafi and the Revolutionary Command Council initiated a process aimed at eliminating any previous political structure and consolidating the new regime. Barely installed in power, the constitution of 1951 was suspended, parliament was abolished, and a total ban on parties was decreed. The traditional institutions of the kingdom were annulled, and in their place emerged a state apparatus controlled directly by the junta of officers. The message was clear: no opposition or alternative to the leadership of the new council would be accepted. In the first weeks, purges were launched against figures linked to King Idris and against anyone who could embody resistance to change. The progressive concentration of power left behind any vestige of pluralism, marking the transition from a collective junta to the exclusive dominion of Gaddafi. The Revolutionary Command Council, headed by Gaddafi as the main figure, assumed power with the argument of carrying out a profound transformation of the country. However, it soon became clear that the new regime would be structured around absolute control of power. Political decisions began to emanate exclusively from the council, with no space for public deliberation or parliamentary representation. The absence of elections was justified as a rejection of Western models, while internal security instruments were strengthened. From the early years of the decade of 1970, Libya entered a period of constant surveillance where political life was replaced by obedience to military authority. In this new scenario, Gaddafi promoted his particular ideological project. Inspired by Arab nationalism but with his own contributions, he began to formulate what would later be known as the Green Book. In it, the colonel sought to offer a total guide for organizing society, presenting it as a third way between communism and capitalism. The text, published in several phases throughout the decade, was converted into official state dogma. It was ordered to be studied in schools, universities, public institutions, and also in community meetings. The idea of direct democracy embodied in the book was used as a justification to dissolve any attempt at pluralism. According to that vision, the people were to express themselves in popular committees, but in practice these bodies were under the surveillance and control of the regime. The text was promoted as a fundamental guide for the new system. Its content was presented as unquestionable, and the population was expected to accept it as the undisputed basis of the revolutionary order. As the Green Book became an obligatory reference, repression intensified. Those who showed doubts, discrepancies, or criticisms were considered enemies of the revolution. Special tribunals were established to prosecute opponents, and detention centers multiplied. Arbitrary imprisonment and the loss of contact with detained relatives contributed to a social climate marked by persistent fear. Surveillance became ubiquitous, reaching from educational institutions to the military establishment itself. To anticipate any sign of disobedience or internal fracture, citizens were forced to demonstrate public loyalty, while in private, fear reigned. The 1970s were also the moment when the regime perfected a system of snitching and social control. The population was urged to report any suspicious activity, generating a climate of widespread mistrust. Neighbors, classmates, or office colleagues could become informants, and that possibility reduced the space for free expression. Arrests for simple comments were common and used as a warning to others. The security apparatus thus managed to extend its influence even into the most intimate spheres of daily life. The official discourse proclaimed that Libya was living a permanent revolution that had returned power to the people. In reality, control was in the hands of a small circle of officials and the central figure of Gaddafi. Traditional institutions were replaced by committees, and the regime built a narrative where all dissent was equated with a threat to the revolution, thus legitimizing the systematic use of repression. In universities, students were forced to participate in political activities organized by the regime, where the ideology of the Green Book was exalted and critics were condemned as counter-revolutionaries. Classrooms became spaces for indoctrination rather than academic teaching. In a short time, the regime established a system where arbitrary detentions became a daily resource to neutralize any dissent. Beyond formal trials, extra-legal spaces emerged where those who were singled out for questioning the official discourse were processed. Reports of physical abuse began to leak out of the country, evidencing a systematic method for suppressing disagreement. Repression no longer responded to exceptional situations, but operated as a constant mechanism to maintain control of power. Meanwhile, Gaddafi consolidated his image abroad as a leader defying the West. His policy of international confrontation reinforced his internal legitimacy, as he presented repression as part of a defense against external plots. In this context, the Green Book was also exported and distributed in other countries, promoted as an alternative model to the capitalist system and Soviet communism. In Africa and the Arab world, the text circulated as a symbol of a different project, although within Libya it was imposed as dogma under threat. Popular committees, presented as an expression of direct democracy, multiplied throughout the country, but in reality, they functioned as surveillance structures that ensured the regime's control over all aspects of daily life. Meetings were monitored, and decisions had to align with the official line. Any dissent could result in immediate reprisals. Through these committees, the regime achieved a constant presence in daily life, from labor matters to neighborhood organization. The process of consolidating power was completed with the elimination of all reference to the previous monarchical system. Symbols of the kingdom were erased, historical narratives were rewritten, and the revolution of 1969 was exalted as the beginning of a new era. Gaddafi, still young, emerged as a central and indispensable figure. The Revolutionary Command Council maintained an important role in the early years, but gradually the colonel placed himself above his comrades, projecting himself as the undisputed leader. During this stage, repression also served to prevent any possible fracture within the regime itself. Officials who showed ambitions were removed, imprisoned, or sent into exile. Power became increasingly concentrated in a narrower circle, where personal loyalty to Gaddafi was the fundamental criterion. The decade of 1970 was marked by this model of political and social control. Libya transformed into a country without parties, without free press, without parliament, and with a citizenry subjected to the dogma of the Green Book. Full prisons and a climate of fear were an inseparable part of the system. The regime justified every measure as necessary to preserve the revolution, while the population lived in constant tension. By the end of those years, Gaddafi's ideological project was firmly established. The Green Book had become an obligatory reference, the popular committees the only form of organization, and repression a permanent tool of government. The regime's machinery functioned with precision. The structures of the state responded to a single center of power, and any form of dissidence was assimilated as treason to the revolution. Libya against the world. After consolidating his internal power, Muammar Gaddafi turned his attention to the international stage. From the mid-1970s, his regime was characterized by a constant confrontation with the West, especially with the United States and the United Kingdom. The Libyan leader sought to project his country as a revolutionary bastion, willing to challenge the powers he considered responsible for domination in the Arab and African world. In that context, Libya began to stand out not only for its oil policy, but also for its open support for armed movements in several regions. Gaddafi's hostility towards Washington intensified as he accused the United States of interfering in the internal affairs of Arab countries and of maintaining military bases in territories he considered part of regional sovereignty. The colonel made that rivalry a central element of his discourse, repeating in international forums that Libya would not submit to foreign pressures. During the same period, London was the target of similar criticism, due to its historical link with the overthrown kingdom and the presence of economic interests in the country. These tensions marked the beginning of a long diplomatic confrontation that would soon escalate into episodes of direct violence. In the second half of the 70s, Gaddafi expanded his external influence through the financing and support of groups considered insurgents in various parts of the world. From Palestinian factions to organizations in Northern Ireland, through movements in West and Central Africa, the Libyan regime presented itself as a sponsor of causes that claimed to fight against oppression. This policy generated alarm in Western governments, which began to identify Libya as a state exporting destabilization. The country was singled out as responsible for training militants in camps located in its territory and for providing weaponry for actions outside its borders. Accusations of Libyan involvement in attacks and covert operations multiplied throughout the following decade. In Europe, attacks were reported in nightclubs, airports, and crowded streets that, according to later investigations, had links to Libyan agents. This growing implication placed the country on Washington's list of state sponsors of terrorism. In response, several Libyan embassies were subjected to progressive isolation and diplomatic restrictions. One of the episodes that accentuated this deterioration occurred in London in 1984, when a shot fired from the Libyan diplomatic mission caused the death of a British police officer during an opposition demonstration in front of the building. The incident generated a crisis of enormous proportions and led to the complete rupture of relations between Libya and the United Kingdom. The confrontation with the United States reached more serious levels during Ronald Reagan's presidency. In American discourse, Gaddafi was defined as one of the most dangerous leaders in the world and as a direct threat to Washington's interests. Tension grew as a result of incidents in the Gulf of Sirte, where the Libyan Navy claimed sovereignty over waters that the United States and its allies considered international. Air and naval clashes in that area ended with Libyan aircraft shot down, fueling the rhetoric of confrontation. In that context, the American government decided to take one more step, to plan a direct attack against regime installations. The bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi in April of 1986 was the culmination of that escalation. American planes launched missiles against military and residential targets, among them the Bab al-Azizia complex, Gaddafi's usual residence. Although the colonel survived, several of his relatives were killed, and the action left a toll of civilian deaths. Washington justified the operation as retaliation for the attack on a discotheque in Berlin frequented by American soldiers, for which it held Libyan agents responsible. The offensive was condemned by numerous countries, but at the same time it consolidated Libya's image as a state openly confronting the West. Despite the blow, Gaddafi did not moderate his discourse. After the bombing, he reinforced the message of resistance and presented his country as a victim of imperialist aggression. Public gatherings multiplied slogans against the United States, while on the international level, support was sought in Africa and among non-aligned movements. However, external pressure did not stop growing. The strategy of supporting armed groups and maintaining operations abroad continued to generate adverse reactions. The episode that marked a point of no return in Libya's isolation was the Lockerbie tragedy in December of 1988. A Pan Am Company plane exploded over that Scottish town, causing the death of more than 270 people. International investigations concluded that the operation had been organized with the direct participation of Libyan agents. From that moment on, the international community adopted severe sanctions. The United Nations Security Council approved resolutions imposing diplomatic restrictions, a ban on flights, and an arms embargo against Libya. Lockerbie not only deepened international hostility, but also served as an argument to prolong the sanctions for a decade. During the decade of 1990, those sanctions caused a considerable deterioration in the Libyan economy. The oil industry, the main source of income, was affected by the difficulty in accessing spare parts and technology. National airlines were unable to operate international routes, and foreign trade suffered a drastic setback. In parallel, diplomatic contacts with Europe and North America were reduced to a minimum. The colonel's image as a marginalized leader intensified, and his figure became increasingly associated with the notion of an isolated rebel ruler. The regime responded by trying to project self-sufficiency. Gaddafi insisted that the sanctions were proof of Libyan strength against foreign conspiracy. Internally, the propaganda apparatus used the blockade as justification for economic difficulties and as a resource to demand more loyalty from the population. Throughout the isolation, the quality of life constantly deteriorated. The scarcity of resources affected all levels of society, from basic services to the educational system, which became increasingly disconnected from the outside world. The Lockerbie case continued to dominate the diplomatic agenda for years. Washington and London demanded the handover of the Libyan suspects to be tried in their territories, while Tripoli refused to recognize that authority. After prolonged negotiations, an agreement was reached in 1999 for the accused to be tried in a neutral court in the Netherlands, under Scottish supervision. That step allowed the partial suspension of sanctions, although the country remained under strong scrutiny. The trial and subsequent conviction of one of those involved confirmed the responsibility of Libyan agents in the attack, which maintained international pressure on the regime. Every new international accusation fueled the perception of a regime that not only opposed the Western order, but did so through actions that openly defied global legal frameworks. Among them were accusations of involvement in attacks in Africa and of supplying weapons to insurgent groups in different regions. The isolation was maintained for more than 1 decade, and Libya went through a period in which its contact with the rest of the world was limited almost exclusively to African channels and discrete ties with some Arab states. International marginalization reinforced the centralization of internal power, with a regime increasingly closed in on itself and with an economy that depended on informal mechanisms to sustain itself. The security apparatus, meanwhile, continued to be the backbone that guaranteed Gaddafi's permanence at the head of the state. The confrontation with the West, the support for armed movements, the bombing of 1986, and the sanctions derived from Lockerbie ended up shaping the image of Libya as a pariah country on the international scene. During those years, the regime sustained itself on the rhetoric of resistance and internal control, while the population suffered the consequences of an almost absolute isolation. Gaddafi ended up symbolizing the tensions of an era marked by the conflict between defiant regimes and the established order, paying for it a high price in international legitimacy. The strategic turn after the Cold War. The end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet bloc left Libya in a fragile position. For years, the country had been under sanctions and isolation, but the world was transforming and the regime needed to adapt. The Libyan leader understood that he had to redraw his strategy if he wanted to ensure the continuity of his power. The first sign of that change was the start of discreet conversations to reduce tensions with Europe, and gradually with the United States. It was no longer about presenting itself as an irreducible enemy of the West, but about opening doors that it had kept closed for decades. The regime had been harassed for years by international sanctions stemming from the Lockerbie bombing, and the economic toll was evident. Oil revenues no longer offset the imposed restrictions, and the effects of the blockade accumulated in all sectors. Pressure from the United Nations had severely limited Libya's ability to trade internationally. In that context, the political leadership began to explore paths of reintegration. It was a slow turn, full of caution, but it represented a fundamental change. Negotiations intensified in the late 90s. European delegations traveled to Tripoli and channels were opened with British diplomats. The regime agreed to hand over 2 Libyan suspects to be tried for the Lockerbie case, a gesture that was interpreted as an unprecedented concession. Although in Libya propaganda presented the decision as an act of sovereignty, abroad it was seen as proof that the colonel was willing to abandon his isolation. This step opened the way for the suspension of sanctions and immediate economic relief. With the arrival of the new century, Gaddafi decided to deepen that approach. In 2003, he surprised by announcing the abandonment of the weapons of mass destruction program. For the international community, it was an unexpected blow, as for years intelligence services had suspected that Libya was seeking nuclear and chemical weapons. With this gesture, the Libyan leader sought to demonstrate that he no longer represented a threat and that he could become an acceptable partner. The decision was made after intense secret conversations with the United States and the United Kingdom, and was presented as a display of responsibility. In practice, it responded to the need to ensure the survival of the regime in a global context marked by the invasion of Iraq and the US offensive against governments accused of supporting terrorism. The abandonment of the nuclear program had immediate consequences. Sanctions were lifted, diplomatic relations were normalized, and above all, investments returned. European and American oil companies once again signed multi-million-dollar contracts to exploit the country's vast resources. Libya regained access to technologies and equipment that had been blocked for years. The regime received growing revenues that allowed it to rebuild its economy and ensure social control. It was a strategic triumph. Without ceding internal power, the colonel managed to reintegrate into the international community. The rapprochement with Europe was particularly intense. Leaders like Tony Blair, Silvio Berlusconi, and Nicolas Sarkozy traveled to Tripoli to sign agreements. Images of Gaddafi receiving Western leaders in his tent became common. The former pariah became a partner with whom oil, arms contracts, and infrastructure projects could be negotiated. Italy, due to its proximity and colonial past, became a key ally. The regime knew how to exploit these relationships to strengthen its external legitimacy. At the same time, the colonel maintained an ambiguous discourse towards his population. While opening up to the world internally, he continued to impose absolute control. The official rhetoric insisted that the Jamahiriya was a singular and unalterable system, but in practice the regime relaxed some economic norms. A certain opening was allowed in sectors such as banking and private investment, though always under the supervision of the ruling circle. The objective was to attract foreign capital and modernize some services without renouncing political monopoly. In those years, infrastructure projects were promoted that sought to show a new image. Roads, public buildings, and the ambitious Great Man-Made River were exhibited as symbols of progress. The regime used these achievements to reinforce the idea that Libya was entering a new stage, connected to the world and capable of offering prosperity. However, beneath that facade of modernization, the repressive structure of the regime continued to operate without substantial changes. Security services continued to monitor opponents, and any attempt at independent political organization was immediately crushed. Foreign policy also transformed. Libya went from supporting armed groups abroad to presenting itself as an ally in the fight against terrorism. After the attacks of the 11th of September, the regime offered information to Western services and sought to show itself as a useful collaborator. This cooperation was rewarded with commercial agreements and official visits. The colonel knew how to adapt to the new international climate and turned Libya into an unexpected partner for governments that had previously treated him as an enemy. Normalization had an immediate effect on daily life. International flights to Tripoli multiplied, and foreign companies set up offices in the country. The population experienced a relative improvement in access to consumer goods and services. However, these advantages were distributed unequally. The benefits of the opening were selectively administered, rewarding those who reinforced clientelist ties with the central power, while areas considered problematic remained marginalized. Control of power remained firm, and the change did not include any real democratization. The strategic shift of the regime also included the positioning of figures from the new generation. One of his sons was particularly highlighted, whose image began to gain visibility internationally as part of the attempt to renew the country's projection. During those years, Libyan diplomacy worked intensely to erase the image of an international pariah. The country was accepted again into regional organizations and approached the African Union, where the colonel sought to present himself as a continental leader. The abundance of oil resources facilitated these aspirations, as Libya could finance projects and buy loyalties. The governmental discourse articulated a narrative of rebirth that concealed the continuity of authoritarianism under a new rhetoric. The new relationship with the West also had its symbolic dimension. Gaddafi was received in European capitals with honors, installed his traditional tent in official gardens, and signed multi-million-dollar agreements. The contrast with the image of previous years was notable. The old enemy became a luxury guest in Paris, London, or Rome. This international recognition was used to reinforce his internal prestige and demonstrate that after decades of isolation, he had managed to impose himself without yielding control of the country. Despite this external transformation, the base of the regime remained the same: fear. Those who dared to question power continued to face imprisonment or disappearance. Attempts to open spaces for debate were controlled and neutralized. The regime's ability to forge ties with foreign powers contrasted with its determination to keep internal mechanisms of absolute control intact. The change of image was accompanied by a renewed discourse. The colonel spoke of cooperation, development, and modernization, setting aside the incendiary rhetoric of previous decades. However, in his country, the structures of power remained intact. Under the appearance of modernization, the institutional system kept its mechanisms of vertical obedience and political exclusion intact. The new Gaddafi appeared before the world with another face, but the logic of the regime remained the same. At the end of the first decade of the 21st century, Libya had reinserted itself onto the world stage. Oil contracts generated extraordinary income, diplomatic relations had normalized, and the colonel enjoyed unprecedented visibility in the West. But beneath that appearance of renewal persisted an authoritarian regime that had not modified its foundations. Partial openness and conciliatory gestures were strategies to survive in a changing international environment, not a path towards democratization. The country continued to be governed by one man, with absolute control over politics and society. Saif al-Islam and the false promises of openness. Saif al-Islam began to appear on the Libyan stage as a distinct figure within the circle of power. His image was carefully constructed, presented as that of the enlightened heir who would bring changes to an aging system. From his first interventions, his discourse sounded different from that of the historical leader, as he spoke of modernization, plurality, and national reconciliation. His words attracted young people, intellectuals, and urban sectors who yearned for an openness that until then seemed impossible. Through him, the idea was transmitted that a new stage was underway and that Libya could integrate into a globalized world without renouncing its internal control. His face began to be used as an emblem of renewal, even while the regime maintained its authoritarian architecture. In that context, Saif promoted initiatives that aimed to open controlled spaces for civil society. Programs were presented to support artists, writers, and journalists who saw a limited opportunity to express different visions. Officially endorsed NGOs were also promoted, functioning as propaganda vehicles without real autonomy. These gestures generated the feeling that a wall of repression was gradually being built, but reality showed another side. Any criticism that exceeded the limits set by the state continued to be severely punished. Detention centers continued to operate, and social surveillance persisted as a structural basis of the system. The reformist mirage fulfilled its function both internally and externally, without altering the essence of power. Saif's messages were amplified in foreign universities and international forums. His time at European academic centers contributed to creating the image of a reformist with solid intellectual credentials. From there, he projected a narrative that spoke of reconciliation with the past and the need to overcome the years of isolation. His words were received with interest by Western diplomats and businessmen who saw in him a reliable interlocutor to guide relations with a regime that had until then been marginalized. International diplomacy, eager to resume ties with a country rich in hydrocarbons, began to treat him as a central figure in any conversation about Libya's future. In this way, his figure was consolidated as a bridge between the old guard and the outside world. Internally, measures aimed at softening the harshness of previous decades were announced. There were partial releases of prisoners considered of low profile, accompanied by declarations on national reconciliation. However, many of these gestures proved symbolic, as clandestine centers remained active and forced disappearances did not cease. The families of regime victims continued to demand information without receiving a response. While some sectors were integrated as a sign of openness, others continued to be repressed without concessions. The supposed reform operated with a selective logic, showing its strategic rather than transformative character. Saif also promoted projects related to economic modernization. There was talk of privatizations, openness to foreign investment, and diversification beyond oil. Conferences were convened where European and North American businessmen were enthusiastically received, while they were guaranteed that the country offered stable conditions under his direction. These initiatives coincided with the intention of showing Libya as a responsible partner after years of international sanctions. However, the benefits were concentrated in a restricted circle linked to the governing elite. Corruption and clientelism continued to mark access to opportunities, while the majority barely perceived concrete improvements in their daily lives. The democratization discourse resonated with youth sectors that had grown up under the weight of a rigid system. Saif promised broader participation, even mentioning the possibility of a new constitution. In conferences and interviews, he spoke of basic freedoms, the need to recognize past mistakes, and to build modern institutions. These statements circulated rapidly in international media, which portrayed him as the budding reformer. However, within the country, any attempt to form independent parties or uncontrolled associations was immediately blocked. The security apparatus did not give ground, and official bodies maintained the political monopoly. The gap between discourse and reality was evident to those living under the regime. The promises of reconciliation included gestures towards former opponents in exile. Meetings were organized with some dissidents willing to return, always under conditions agreed upon with the authorities. These returns were presented as gestures of tolerance and overcoming the past, but in practice they were conditioned. Many preferred to stay away due to the lack of guarantees, and those who accepted to return did so with explicit restrictions, knowing that any deviation could cost them their freedom. The process served as a showcase to present a reconciled Libya, although control remained intact. Saif al-Islam's strategy also relied on cultural patronage. Film festivals, art exhibitions, and academic conferences were organized with the endorsement of foundations linked to his figure. These initiatives sought to project an image of an open and modern country. However, behind the scenes, the margins were clearly defined. Censorship continued to regulate content, and any critical allusion was removed. Artists knew that their creativity had to remain within tolerated limits. Thus, the cultural impulse reinforced the narrative of openness without touching the real structure of power. In the media, adjustments simulating openness were introduced, allowing a certain thematic margin on non-political issues. Some publications began to cover cultural and social matters that previously had no space, which contributed to projecting an image of renewal. However, the red lines remained firm. The structures of power remained beyond any questioning. Under that premise, the information system retained its role as a subordinate instrument, where all apparent diversity was carefully contained. The promises of modernization also included the legal field. Saif spoke on several occasions of the need to replace the framework of revolutionary norms with a more modern legal framework. The professionalization of the courts and the search for greater transparency were mentioned. Nevertheless, the judicial system remained subordinate to the security agencies. Judicial independence was not achieved, and the legal apparatus continued to be used as an instrument of pressure. Consequently, the legal proposals remained part of the catalogue of unmaterialized promises. Internationally, Saif became the friendly face of the regime. European governments received him on official visits and invited him to forums on cooperation and development. He spoke of reconciliation, investment and human rights, while presenting reports on advances in rights and governance. These documents were received with caution, but were enough to reactivate economic agreements and unblock energy contracts. The reformist narrative was sufficient to convince many external actors more interested in stability and resources than in profound transformations. Thus, the international position of the regime improved without altering its internal functioning. Within the country, the perception evolved over time. At the beginning, many saw in Saif a hope for real transformation, but the passing of the years without substantial changes eroded that trust. The repressive apparatus was adapted, not dismantled. It operated with new forms, but with the same purpose of total control. The population understood that the reformist impulse responded more to a stabilization strategy than to a genuine will for openness. Over time, expectations were diluted between symbolic gestures and constant restrictions, confirming that the margin for authentic openness remained null. The rebellion in Benghazi and the start of the civil war. The beginning of the year 2011 in North Africa was marked by the collapse of governments that seemed unmovable. In Tunisia, the departure of Ben Ali demonstrated that an authoritarian regime could crumble in a matter of weeks. In Egypt, the crowds in Tahrir Square forced the resignation of Hosni Mubarak after decades in power. Those images swept through the region and reached Libya, where for more than 40 years the population had lived under a rigid and monitored system. The echo of neighboring revolts ignited expectations in a country where the wounds of accumulated repression remained open. In that context, Benghazi, an eastern city with a long tradition of resistance, became the trigger for a process that would transform the country's destiny. The protests began as small gatherings demanding the release of political prisoners and improvements in daily life. The climate was one of contained tension, as security forces had suppressed any attempt at independent organization for decades. However, the spark ignited when authorities responded with violence to the first marches. Demonstrators, who had come out with peaceful slogans, faced bullets and tear gas. The clash radicalized sectors that had not mobilized until then and created a domino effect. As reports of dead and wounded circulated through the city, more people joined the streets, convinced that it was time to challenge the established power. The uprising, initially contained, expanded with unstoppable speed. The regime's reaction was to tighten repression. Loyal troops and brigades were deployed with clear orders to suppress any sign of insurrection. However, the excessive use of force produced the opposite effect. The funerals of the first fallen ceased to be private ceremonies and became public acts that renewed the protest. Slogans against the government multiplied at each burial, and the cycle of mobilization and repression intensified. In a matter of days, Benghazi went from being a city under surveillance to a territory in open confrontation with the central power. Desertions within military and security ranks were a decisive factor. Officers and soldiers, many of them originally from the east of the country, refused to shoot against their communities. Some handed over their weapons, others joined improvised defense committees. The weakening of the military structure, accelerated by numerous defections, eroded the regime's repressive capacity. Groups of armed youths, with recovered rifles and adapted vehicles, began to organize defense points in neighborhoods and strategic buildings. The insurgency moved from slogans to armed resistance. The political vacuum generated by the withdrawal of authority in Benghazi led to the formation of the National Transitional Council. This body emerged from the union between lawyers, judges, academics, and respected figures of the city, with the intention of giving structure to the insurgent movement. Its initial objective was to represent the rebel population and coordinate the resistance. In a few days, the council issued communiques and assumed functions that previously corresponded to the state. The tricolour flag of the Old Kingdom once again waved in public buildings as a symbol of rupture with the regime. It was a clear political statement. It was not just a protest, but the beginning of a process of replacing the existing order. The civil war was beginning to take shape. While the eastern cities remained under the control of the National Transitional Council, Tripoli responded with aggressive messages, accusing the insurgents of treason and foreign manipulations. State media tried to show images of unity, but on the ground the fracture was evident. The country remained divided between an insurgent east and a still loyal west, resuming historical lines of regional separation. With each combat, that division became deeper and more visible. The regime concentrated its forces on one objective: to recapture Benghazi. It understood that losing the second most important city meant a devastating blow. Columns of tanks and heavy artillery advanced eastward, determined to suppress the rebellion before it consolidated. However, the resistance was more organized than expected. The insurgents, strengthened by the adherence of ex-military personnel and popular support, offered a coordinated defense. The streets filled with improvised barricades, and the entire city threw itself into the effort. Neighbors offered food, fuel, and shelter to the combatants. Benghazi stood as a symbolic reference of a resistance that overflowed local boundaries. In parallel, the National Transitional Council understood the need for external backing. Emissaries traveled abroad, seeking political legitimacy and logistical support. The narrative they spread showed a people determined to free themselves from a prolonged dictatorship, appealing to international solidarity. At the same time, they tried to articulate a rudimentary chain of command among the armed groups emerging in the region. Although discipline was variable, the will to fight was firm. The first victories in nearby localities reinforced morale. In Al-Baida, Derna and Tobruk, protesters managed to expel loyalist forces and establish local management committees. The rebellion expanded beyond Benghazi, showing that it was not an isolated phenomenon. The eastern tribes, traditionally distant from central power, played a key role in sustaining the insurrection. The regime tried to regain ground with aerial bombardments, but the process had already reached a point of no return. The contrast between Tripoli and Benghazi sharpened. In the capital, the leader appeared surrounded by followers in carefully produced images, while promising to resist until the end. In the east, reality was shown in columns of smoke, destroyed buildings and barricades. International media began to change focus. What had started as a peaceful protest was transforming into open warfare. The eastern city became a symbol and operational center of a rebellion that directly challenged the longest-standing regime in the region. As fighting increased in the east of the country, various organizations began to document what was happening on the ground. Testimonies and recordings showed the direct impact of the offensive on civilian sectors. In Benghazi, hospitals collapsed, and entire neighborhoods were isolated by the clashes. The city, transformed into the epicenter of the uprising, faced a growing risk of total destruction. Faced with this scenario, the National Transitional Council intensified its contacts with foreign governments, warning of a possible massacre if action was not taken in time. Internally, the insurrection marked the definitive rupture of the myth of the regime's invulnerability. For decades, the idea that any dissent was useless had been imposed, but the loss of control over the east proved otherwise. The images of occupied public buildings, rebel flags in the squares, and citizens making decisions outside the state generated an irreparable symbolic blow. The regime still retained key resources and territories, but had lost the monopoly on authority. What began in Benghazi lit a fuse that could not be extinguished. Libya was entering a new stage, with the conflict expanding beyond its streets to the entire national territory. The intervention of NATO and the fall of Tripoli. The crisis in Libya entered a new stage when the United Nations Security Council approved the resolution authorizing the use of force to protect the civilian population. The regime had threatened to raise Benghazi and retake the east by means of an all-out attack, which led the international community to react. The resolution allowed the establishment of a no-fly zone and authorized member states to employ all necessary means to halt the advances of loyalist forces. The measure paved the way for NATO's military intervention, which quickly assumed command of operations. From that moment, the Libyan conflict ceased to be an internal matter and transformed into the scenario for an international military action unprecedented in the country. The first bombings were directed against anti-aircraft defenses and air bases controlled by the regime's forces. The objective was to neutralize air attack capability and create conditions for the rebels to resist without being crushed from the sky. In a matter of hours, the alliance's planes destroyed radars, missile systems, and hangars. Images of smoke columns on the outskirts of Tripoli and at nearby military bases spread immediately. The technological superiority of the coalition became clear from the beginning, as the Libyan defense systems proved incapable of responding effectively. The military apparatus that had sustained the regime for decades was overcome by the firepower of a joint operation led by Western powers. After the initial attack, the campaign focused on striking the ground units advancing toward the rebel cities. Armored convoys and artillery concentrations became priority targets. NATO aircraft patrolled the airspace daily, ready to attack any movement that represented a direct threat against the population. For the insurgents on the ground, the effect was immediate. They stopped facing constant bombardments and were able to reorganize their positions. In Benghazi, the fear of a final assault dissipated, and the population regained confidence. The strategic change proved crucial, as it transformed a retreating resistance into a movement capable of regaining ground. In Tripoli, the regime denounced the intervention as foreign aggression and tried to mobilize the population with speeches calling to resist the invasion. Official media broadcast images of rallies in squares where support for the leader was shown. However, military pressure and diplomatic isolation were becoming increasingly suffocating. The capital lived under selective bombings that struck state apparatus buildings, command centers, and arsenals. Although NATO insisted that the attacks sought only military objectives, the daily life of the capital's inhabitants was profoundly altered. Sirens and explosions became part of the night routine, while the population sought refuge in basements and mosques. The advance of the rebels, supported by airstrikes, was constant throughout the summer of 2011. Cities that had been under regime control began to fall one after another. The route to Tripoli gradually opened thanks to the combination of airstrikes and local uprisings that weakened defenses. Misrata, the scene of particularly harsh fighting, resisted a prolonged siege until air pressure allowed insurgents to break the encirclement. The coastal city became a symbol of resistance, and its liberation further boosted the advance towards the capital. The regime, unable to maintain control over the entire territory, retreated as the battlefronts approached the heart of power. The fall of Tripoli began to take shape when rebels managed to coordinate an attack from several directions. Columns from Misrata, Zawiya, and the mountainous Nafusa region converged on the capital. NATO intensified bombings against strategic positions, destroying weapons depots and communications centers. In parallel, clandestine cells in Tripoli itself began to mobilize, attacking checkpoints and creating chaos in different neighborhoods. The regime tried to respond by deploying its most loyal brigades, but the pressure proved unsustainable. Within days, fighting moved to the city center, with clashes around government buildings and on main avenues. The Bab al-Aziziyah complex, a symbol of the leader's power for decades, fell into rebel hands after intense fighting, definitively altering control over the capital. The image of rebels occupying the residence that had been the scene of official receptions and televised speeches was an irreparable symbolic blow to the regime. The flags of the National Transitional Council waved over the complex, while scenes of personal archives and destroyed portraits were circulated. The population took to the streets to celebrate the end of regime control in the capital, although sporadic fighting continued in some sectors. The fall of Tripoli did not mean the immediate end of the conflict, but it did represent the loss of the most important political and administrative center. From that moment, the leader's survival depended on his ability to maintain support in reduced enclaves. The retreat to Sirte was the immediate response of Gaddafi and his inner circle. The coastal city, the leader's birthplace, became the last bastion of resistance. Loyalists, armed brigades and family members gathered there, convinced that they could withstand the siege. Sirte became a refuge but also a trap. Airstrikes continued to hit access routes, and convoys attempting to transport supplies were destroyed from the air. The encirclement tightened, reducing the room for maneuver. Meanwhile, the National Transitional Council moved its political base to Tripoli and began to consolidate its authority as the new power recognized by a large part of the international community. In parallel, the judicial prosecution also advanced. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against the leader, some of his sons and close collaborators, accusing them of crimes against humanity. These accusations reinforced global pressure and further reduced the possibilities of negotiation. Countries that had previously maintained ties with the regime began to recognize the council as the legitimate representative of the country. The fall of the capital and international isolation made it clear that the leader's era was coming to an end. The struggle was reduced to enclaves like Sirte and Bani Walid, which were preparing for final confrontations. NATO's intervention had completely altered the balance of the conflict. Without the airstrikes, the rebellion would hardly have resisted the initial assault on Benghazi. With them, the rebels not only survived, but advanced to overthrow the regime in its own heartland. The air campaign, with thousands of missions carried out, showed the alliance's capacity to intervene decisively in an internal conflict. However, it also opened a debate about the limits of the United Nations resolution and the nature of the operation. For the insurgents, it was the difference between survival and defeat. For the regime, it represented the blow that ended more than 4 decades of dominance. Life in Tripoli after the fall of the regime changed radically. Institutions were left in ruins, and the new power had to face the challenge of administering a city traumatized by months of fighting and bombing. The militiamen who had led the offensive settled in neighborhoods and buildings, while basic services were just beginning to be restored. The transition promised by the National Transitional Council faced the difficulty of imposing order amidst euphoria and disarray. The capital, which had lived for years under strict surveillance, now became a space for celebrations, but also for uncertainty. The war had not ended, and clashes in Sirte and Bani Walid showed that there were still battles to be fought. Hunted as a beast, capture and death of Gaddafi. In the last days of October of 2011, Sirte had been transformed into a field of ruins under constant siege. Muammar Gaddafi's hometown, converted into his last refuge, was surrounded by rebel forces supported from the air by NATO. The neighborhoods that once housed families loyal to the regime were devastated by bombings, the streets covered in debris and charred vehicles. In that environment, the former leader remained hidden in a network of tunnels and destroyed homes, accompanied by a small circle of bodyguards. Without regular access to drinking water, with scarce food and no communications, the man who had dominated Libya for more than 4 decades found himself isolated, without command or contact with the outside. The rebel forces had concentrated their offensive around Sirte because they understood that the last symbols of resistance were taking refuge there. The brigades surrounding the city received reports about the leader's presence somewhere in the urban center, though without precision. For days, air attacks against fleeing convoys intensified, and drones monitored the ground searching for signs of the leader. The military pressure was unsustainable. New defensive positions fell each day, and loyalists were confined to an increasingly smaller area. On the dawn of the 20th of October, a convoy of armored vehicles and pickup trucks departed from the area where he was taking refuge. He was accompanied by members of his personal guard and trusted figures. The column advanced through destroyed streets with the intention of leaving the city heading south, towards regions where supporters still existed. But the attempt was intercepted. French aviation, part of the international coalition, detected the movement and launched a precise attack. Several vehicles were hit by missiles, exploding in the middle of the road. The convoy was broken up and the survivors fled in different directions. Gaddafi, dazed and covered in dust, took refuge with a few men in a concrete drainage pipe of an underground culvert, among rats, stagnant water and debris. Accustomed for years to appearing at luxurious receptions, he now found himself crouched underground, while outside gunshots and voices of pursuit echoed. The rebels, guided by aerial reconnaissance information, searched the area with increasing intensity. Shortly after midday, fighters from Misrata located the culvert where he was hiding. Shouts were heard when they discovered him inside the pipe. wounded and unarmed. Images taken with mobile phones showed a confused man dragged amidst pushes by a crowd that did not stop hitting him. The moment of capture was chaotic. Dozens of fighters crowded around, recorded the scene, and displayed him as a trophy before the cameras. During the improvised transfer to a vehicle, the blows and aggressions continued. Some tried to take him alive, but the pressure from the crowd was uncontrollable. Amidst the struggles, acts of brutality occurred that left visible marks on his body. The insults, shots fired into the air, and disorder reflected the lack of clear authority. The journey to Misurata, where he was to be presented, turned into an uncontrolled lynching. The former ruler was treated as spoils of war, reduced to the condition of a defenseless prisoner. The execution occurred without trial or process. His death, caused by bullet impacts at very close range, was recorded in multiple recordings that circulated immediately throughout the world. The remains were transferred to Misrata, where it was decided to display the body in an industrial refrigerator. For days, hundreds of people lined up to see the fallen leader. The scene became a spectacle. Some celebrated it as justice, others recorded it morbidly. The prolonged exposure generated international criticism for its lack of dignity. The final destination of the corpse was kept secret. Fearing that his tomb would become a place of pilgrimage or dispute, the new authorities ordered a clandestine burial in the desert. Only a small group participated in the burial, carried out at dawn and without a public ceremony. Thus ended the physical history of the one who had dominated Libya for more than 4 decades. Although his body disappeared, the images of his fall remained etched in the collective memory. However, that end did not bring order or justice. The lynching, instead of inaugurating a peaceful transition, exposed the absence of structures capable of guaranteeing legality or reconciliation. The violence of the outcome anticipated the disorder that was approaching. For a large part of the population, seeing the former leader turned into a corpse was the undisputed sign that the era of the regime had concluded, although the immediate future offered neither clarity nor promises. With the passage of time, less visible aspects of the regime he led also began to emerge. For decades, Gaddafi had cultivated an enigmatic and striking figure, his suits, his theatrical displays, and his customs outside of protocol. But alongside that image, a network of private practices was sustained, which only became known in greater detail after his death. Among them was the existence of a personal female escort, presented as a loyal and symbolic force. Years later, accounts began to circulate about the true nature of that environment, composed of women whose presence responded to power relationships marked by inequality and the leader's personal control. Later investigations revealed that in some official residences, there were rooms closed to public access used for purposes unrelated to protocol. Some testimonies collected after the fall of the regime alluded to a direct selection of young people, often during institutional visits, who were transferred without explanation to those spaces. There, the leader's power was exercised unilaterally under a logic that left the victims without possibility of defense. To this were added extraterritorial operations driven by the regime services. For years, opposition members in exile were subjected to surveillance, threats, or covert actions. The message was clear. Dissent was not tolerated anywhere, and the hand of the regime could reach them even outside Libya. The wealth that sustained this network was immense. Coming from oil revenues and managed with opacity, it was used to support patronage networks, finance political operations, and reinforce a lifestyle alien to the daily reality of the majority. Although the exact figures were never confirmed, various international estimates placed him among the wealthiest heads of state on the continent. That system of power was not documented in laws nor visible in official bodies. It operated in parallel, protected by fear, silence, and obedience. Its fall not only left institutional voids, it also exposed an informal structure of abuses that for years had been normalized by those who feared it or served it. Gaddafi's death was not only the end of a regime, but the collapse of an architecture of power that extended beyond what was visible. Once the leader was overthrown, what emerged was a fractured country, wounded and full of hidden scars, and also a memory that, little by little, began to tell what had been silenced for so long.